My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 34 years old. On June 14th, at approximately 5:22 in the evening, my sister's new father-in-law stood up at the reception head table and quoted an invoice number 097,734 AHG that I had authored 11 months earlier for a structural remediation project on the very building we were sitting inside. That invoice was for $214,000. My family had spent the previous 40 minutes making sure everyone in the room understood that I was nothing. I noticed the napkin fold first. Whoever had set the tables used a bishop's mitre fold, which requires a minimum fabric weight of at least 280 GSM to hold its shape through a 4-hour reception. The linen was closer to 220. The folds were already softening at the peaks, and by dessert they would sag into shapeless triangles. I registered this before I registered that there was no place setting where I was standing. My fingers found the back of the empty chair beside me and gripped the wood until I felt the grain press into my thumb pad. I did not move. I was already counting. The seating chart had listed me at table 14. There were 13 tables. My mother looked at me from across the foyer and said, "We thought you'd prefer to float." Noted. She had turned back to the florist before I finished hearing the sentence. That was her fourth logistical erasure in 6 weeks. I had already logged the first 3. Before I lay out what I found and what it cost them when I did, I want to know something. What time is it where you are? I've learned to note the time of things. It matters more than people realize. My profession is structural forensic analysis. Specifically, I investigate post-construction failures, buildings that crack, shift, settle, or degrade in ways the original engineering said they would not. Municipal governments, insurance companies, and litigation firms hire me to determine whether a failure was caused by environmental force, material deficiency, or human decision. I spend my working life reading documents that were created to look correct and finding the single data point that proves they are not. I can identify a falsified load-bearing report from its pagination alone. I once flagged a fraudulent concrete batch certificate because the aggregate gradation was listed in metric but the slump test was recorded in imperial, and no legitimate lab in the state uses mixed units. I noticed the thing that does not belong, not because I am suspicious by nature, but because structures fail at the junction between what was promised and what was delivered. That skill had exposed $23 million in construction fraud across 9 years of professional practice. It was about to expose my own family. I grew up in a household where contribution was measured by visibility. My father, Russell Whitfield, was a commercial general contractor, modestly successful, regional jobs, strip malls, medical office build-outs, the occasional municipal renovation. My mother, Diane, managed the books and the social calendar with equal precision. My older sister, Lauren, was the axis around which everything rotated. She was warm, she was visible, she had a talent for entering a room in a way that made the room feel grateful. I was quiet, I was good at math. I was the one who came home with a 98 and was asked what happened to the other 2 points. That is not a complaint, that is a structural observation about how the system allocated value. When I was 19, I deferred a full academic scholarship to Michigan, structural engineering, 4-year guaranteed funding, because my father needed help managing job site documentation after his office manager quit. He said it would be 6 months, it was 3 years. I reorganized his filing system, digitized 11 years of permits and inspection records, trained his replacement, and reapplied to Michigan at 22, with the scholarship no longer available. I paid for the degree myself, took 7 years including the master's work. I finished at 29 with $61,400 in student debt and a professional reputation that was already producing independent contract work. During those 7 years, Lauren graduated from a private university my parents paid for in full, worked briefly in event coordination, and became engaged to Marcus Delaney, whose father, Richard Delaney, owned a regional development firm. The engagement lasted 14 months. The wedding planning lasted all 14 of them. My parents contributed $48,000. They told me this proudly, over Thanksgiving, the same week I asked my mother to co-sign on a refinance that would have saved me $190 a month in interest. She said the timing was not great. I logged that incident on November 23rd. It was a Thursday. The pattern was consistent. Incident: Lauren's destination bachelorette, funded by my parents, $6,200 for a 5-day rental in Savannah, including flights for 6 friends. Date: March of the following year. My contribution requested: coordinate the logistics. Incident: my request: 2 months later, for my parents to watch my apartment while I traveled for a 10-day forensic assessment in Baton Rouge that would pay $18,000. Response: we're not really available. They were available. I checked the family calendar my mother kept pinned to the refrigerator. The week was blank. The irony was that I had spent a decade learning to read buildings, to see exactly where the stress was concentrated, where the supports were missing, where the whole thing was quietly failing. I was living inside a structure I refused to inspect. 6 weeks before the wedding, Lauren called me. Her voice was efficient, not unkind. She said, "Clara, we're keeping the bridal party to 4. Marcus's sister and my 3 college friends. You understand?" I said I understood. She said there would be a reading during the ceremony, and she would love for me to do it. A poem, something short. I agreed. She texted me the poem that evening. It was 9 lines long. It was about a garden and a gate. 4 weeks before the wedding, my mother called. She asked me to handle coordination with the venue regarding a structural concern. The venue, Hargrove Hall, was a renovated 1920s cotton warehouse in the Delaney family portfolio that Richard Delaney had converted into an event space. The floor in the East Gallery had developed a deflection, a noticeable dip near the service entrance. The venue manager wanted assurance it was cosmetic. My mother said, "You do this kind of thing, can you just look at it?" I drove 90 minutes each way. I spent 4 hours on site. I identified the deflection as a joist-bearing issue at the subfloor level, likely caused by moisture infiltration along the original foundation wall. I wrote a remediation scope. I referred the venue to a licensed repair contractor. I did not charge for this. I was not thanked. The remediation cost $214,000. Invoice 097,734 AHG was the one I authored for the scope of work. Richard Delaney's firm paid it. I learned later that my parents had told the Delaneys the assessment was Lauren's idea. I arrived at Hargrove Hall the day of the wedding at 3:45 in the afternoon. My dress was a navy silk sheath I had bought for $340, the most I had ever spent on a garment. I had my reading printed on a card in my jacket pocket. I was carrying a small wrapped gift, a set of Japanese ceramic teacups I had chosen because Lauren once mentioned, 5 years earlier, loving the weight of ceramic in her hands. There was no place card for me. Table 14 did not exist. I stood in the foyer holding the gift for 6 minutes before anyone spoke to me, and the person who spoke was a caterer, asking if I needed directions to the restroom. At dinner, my mother seated me at a half table near the kitchen entrance that had been set up, I was told, because of a last-minute head count adjustment. The table had 3 seats. The other 2 were occupied by the groom's cousins, ages 11 and 15, who were watching something on a phone with the volume low. My mother did not sit with me. She did not come to the table. The chair beside me had no napkin. I could hear the kitchen extraction fan cycling at roughly 60 hertz, a low drone that rattled a loose screw in the ceiling vent plate. Lauren's maid of honor gave a toast at 5:04. She mentioned Lauren's generosity, her grace, her gift for making people feel seen. At 5:11, my father stood. He raised his glass. He spoke about Lauren and Marcus, and partnership and family. He said, "Lauren has always been the heart of this family." He said, "She got that from her mother." He did not mention me. He did not mention my reading, which had been quietly removed from the program. I found this out when I opened the printed ceremony booklet and saw my name was not in it. The poem I had rehearsed 14 times was replaced by a recorded song. At 5:18, my Aunt Denise, my mother's sister, leaned toward a table of family friends and said, loudly enough for me and the children beside me to hear, "Clara's always been a bit lost. Diane tries, but you can't steer someone who doesn't know where they're going." 2 women laughed. One of them glanced at me. I was cutting a piece of salmon. I set the knife down and placed both palms flat on the tablecloth. The extraction fan hummed. I felt the table's surface temperature through my hands. Cool, commercial-grade laminate under the cloth, not the mahogany of the main tables. I did not move. Something in me was running numbers I had not asked it to run. At 5:22, Richard Delaney stood. He was not scheduled to speak. The MC looked uncertain. Richard is a large, careful man who speaks the way engineers write, declarative, cited, load-bearing. He said he wanted to say something about family. He said, "Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge someone in this room who most of you do not know nearly well enough." He looked at me. Clara Whitfield authored the structural assessment that identified a critical joist failure in this building's East Gallery 11 months ago. Her work led to a $214,000 remediation that made this event, and every event after it, safe. When my firm's engineers reviewed her scope, 3 of them told me independently that her analysis was the most precise forensic assessment they had seen in a decade. Invoice 097734 AHG. I have it framed in my office. He paused. I was told this assessment was Lauren's idea. 3 weeks ago, I learned from my own project manager that it was Clara who drove here, alone, on her own time, without compensation, and produced the work. Nobody told me, nobody told anyone. He looked at my parents. I want to make sure the record is accurate. In my business, accuracy is not optional. The room was silent. I could hear the extraction fan. Richard Delaney sat down. The silence held for 4 seconds. Then Lauren's maid of honor started clapping, uncertainly, and others followed. That speech cracked the surface. But the surface had been cracking for a long time, and what I found underneath it was worse than a missing place card. Then I found something else. 3 days after the wedding, I received a text from Richard Delaney's project manager, a woman named Sandra Coe, asking me to verify a second invoice, one I had never seen. The invoice was formatted identically to mine, same header font, same scope of work section template, same clause structure, but the billing entity was not my firm. It was my father's company, Whitfield Commercial Services. The invoice was for $47,500, described as consulting oversight, structural remediation coordination, Hargrove Hall. It was dated 2 weeks after my original assessment. My father had billed Richard Delaney's firm for oversight of work I had performed, using a document modeled on my own invoice template. The formatting was almost correct. Almost. The page margin was set to 1.0 inches. My invoices use 0.75-inch margins, an artifact of the Michigan template system I adopted in graduate school and never changed. Anyone could miss this. I could not miss it. I opened the document properties. The author field read D. Whitfield, created on a device named Dane Home HP. My mother had typed it. Then I found something else. I requested a full accounts receivable history from Sandra Coe for any payments made to Whitfield Commercial Services. There were 4 additional invoices spanning 3 years, $12,000 for site consultation, foundation assessment, $8,500 for materials compliance advisory, $19,000 for structural load verification, Phase 2 gallery renovation, $14,200 for environmental pre-screening coordination. Total billed to the Delaney firm under my father's company, using language derived from my professional work, $101,200. I had performed 0 of these services. I had authorized none of these invoices. My name appeared nowhere on them, but the technical language could only have come from someone who had read my reports. Then I found something else. This was not the first time my parents had monetized someone else's professional work under their own name. I contacted the 3 previous clients listed in my father's archived state contractor filings, records I had digitized myself at 19, and confirmed that at least 2 of them had been billed for consultation services performed by my father's former office manager, a woman named Gail Tenney. Gail had left the company abruptly. I found Gail. She told me calmly that she had discovered the billing arrangement and that my father had offered her a $4,000 severance to leave without discussing it. She left. She kept the severance letter. She had the original. Then I found something else, the document that made everything before it irrelevant. Not because it was worse, because it was first. Among the files I had digitized at 19, the same files I had organized into my father's system, there was a folder I had labeled MSECG Archive and never reopened. Inside that folder was a scanned copy of a consulting agreement between my father and the Delaney firm, predating my involvement by 6 years, in which my father had listed himself as a licensed structural consultant. My father is not a licensed structural engineer. He has never held that credential. The agreement was the seed document, the original misrepresentation that made every subsequent invoice possible. My mother had co-signed it as a corporate officer of Whitfield Commercial Services. The signature block was correct in every respect except one. My mother's middle initial was listed as M. Her middle initial is L. The wrong letter, typed, not handwritten. The kind of error that occurs when someone is filling in a template from memory, rather than copying from an original document. The kind of error I was trained to find. I compiled everything, every invoice, every author field, every margin discrepancy, every accounts receivable record, every email timestamp from Sandra Coe, Gail Tenney's severance letter, the original consulting agreement with the wrong middle initial. I organized it the way I organize a forensic failure report, chronologically, cited, cross-referenced. I printed 2 copies, one for Richard Delaney, one for the State Licensing Board. 4 weeks after the wedding, Richard Delaney hosted a quarterly partners' dinner at Hargrove Hall, the same building, the same East Gallery, the same floor I had saved. My parents were invited, Lauren and Marcus were invited. I was not invited. Richard Delaney invited me personally, by phone, 3 days before the dinner. He said, "I'd like you to be there, Clara. There are some things that should be said in the room where they happened." I arrived at 6:40. The gallery looked different, dressed for a small dinner, 12-place settings, heavy linen, candles in low glass holders. The floor was solid, I could feel it under my feet, no deflection, no give, the remediation had held. My parents were already seated. Lauren was beside Marcus. My Aunt Denise was at the far end of the table. I sat where Richard directed me, directly across from my mother. At 7:15, after the first course, Richard stood again. He said he had a business matter to address. He placed a folder on the table. He opened it. He read the first invoice aloud, the $47,500 one. He asked my father if he recognized it. My father said, "That's a standard coordination fee. We discussed this." Richard placed the second invoice beside it, then the third, then the fourth. He read the total, $101,200. My father said, "Those are legitimate consulting services." Richard said, "Your firm does not hold a structural engineering license." My mother said, "This is not the place for this." Richard said, "The place was your daughter's table. You seated her next to the kitchen." My father stood. He said, "I have given 20 years of partnership to this family. You do not ambush me in front of my children." Lauren said, "Can we please not do this tonight?" My mother said, "Clara has always had difficulty understanding boundaries. She's been like this since she was young." My Aunt Denise said, "This is exactly what I was talking about. She creates problems wherever she goes." I placed my folder on the table. I opened it to the consulting agreement, the one with the wrong middle initial. I turned it toward my mother. I said one sentence. "You billed his company for my work using a credential Dad never held, and a middle initial you got wrong because you typed it from memory." I did not say anything else. The room was still. Sandra Coe, seated 2 chairs from Richard, said, "I've independently verified every line item in that file with our accounts receivable department. The discrepancies are documented." Sandra had not been announced. My parents did not know she would be there. She was the project manager who had first contacted me. She had kept her own records from the beginning. My father looked at Sandra, then at Richard. He said, "This has been taken out of context." Richard said, "The context is in the file. I've read it." Lauren looked at the consulting agreement. She looked at my mother's signature. She said, very quietly, "Mom, Mom." My mother picked up her water glass, set it down without drinking, and said, "We did what we thought was appropriate given the circumstances." Nobody responded. Consequences moved at the speed of paperwork, which is slower than anger and more permanent. Richard Delaney's firm terminated all existing contracts with Whitfield Commercial Services within 10 days. The total value of lost future work was approximately $340,000 across 3 active projects. My father received a formal demand for restitution of the $101,200 in fraudulent invoices. He retained an attorney. The attorney advised settling. My father settled for $78,000, the remainder offset by work he had actually performed in a general contracting capacity on unrelated Delaney projects. The payment came from my parents' savings. The state licensing board opened an investigation into the consulting agreement. My father was not a licensed engineer and had represented himself as one in a binding contract. The investigation resulted in a formal citation and a prohibition on Whitfield Commercial Services performing or advertising any engineering-adjacent services. The citation was public record. Lauren did not speak to my parents for 3 weeks after the dinner. When she resumed contact, it was through Marcus, not directly. She called me once, 11 days after the confrontation. She said, "I didn't know about the invoices." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have known about the table." I waited. She said, "I'm sorry about the table." I said, "Thank you." I did not say it was fine. It was not fine. We have spoken 4 times since. The conversations are short and careful, like walking on a surface you are not sure will hold. My Aunt Denise called my mother the day after the dinner and told her she had been right to protect Russell. 2 weeks later, after the licensing board citation became public, Denise sent me a text message that said, "I may have spoken out of turn at the wedding. I didn't have the full picture." I read the message twice. I did not respond for 3 days. When I did, I wrote, "Thank you for saying that." I did not write that it was enough. I did not write that I understood. Denise had repeated a story about me for years without verifying a single detail. Her apology was real. It was also 11 years late and addressed only the sentence at the wedding, not the ones that came before it. I let it sit. Mutbuli ridani shoro. Sandra Coe left Richard's firm 4 months later for a position with a national engineering consultancy. Before she left, she sent me a brief email. "Your documentation standard is the reason I kept my own files. I thought you should know that." I printed the email. It is in the same folder as the invoices. My parents have not contacted me directly since the dinner. My mother sent a birthday card in October, 4 months after the confrontation, with a check for $200 and a note that read, "Thinking of you. Love, Mom and Dad." The check was drawn on the same account that had funded the $48,000 wedding contribution. I did not cash it. I placed it in a file labeled Correspondence, Whitfield, and closed the drawer. I no longer work exclusively as a subcontractor. 8 months after the wedding, I incorporated my own forensic analysis firm. I hired a part-time project coordinator. I signed my first direct municipal contract, a school district in southeastern Ohio that needed a full structural assessment of 4 buildings built in the 1960s. The contract value was $89,000. I performed the work myself. I wrote the reports in my own name. Every invoice, every scope, every document, authored, billed, and credited correctly, to me. I sit at a desk now that I chose. A plain oak desk in a second-floor office, with one window that faces east. On that desk, this morning, I wrote a number on a blank page, the same number Richard Delaney read aloud at a wedding where I did not have a seat, $214,000. Except now it is the 12-month gross revenue of my own firm, projected for this fiscal year. Same number, different author field. What I learned from this, and it took longer to learn than it should have, is that silence inside a family operates exactly the way silence operates inside a failing structure. It is not neutral. Silence is load-bearing. Every person who saw the pattern and said nothing was not abstaining. They were holding the pattern in place. My aunt's laughter at the wedding table was not separate from my mother's invoice. My father's toast that did not mention my name was not separate from the consulting agreement that used a credential he did not have. These were not isolated failures. They were the same system, distributing weight unevenly, and the people who said nothing were the joists. I do not believe consequences are revenge. I believe consequences are what happens when a structure is finally inspected by someone qualified to read it. The structure was always failing. The inspection did not cause the failure. It made the failure visible. And visible failures can be addressed. Hidden ones just keep settling until something collapses and someone gets hurt. When you watched it happen and stayed quiet, when you heard the joke, or saw the empty chair, or repeated the version of the story you were given without checking, what were you protecting? Because it was not them. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.